Welcome, everyone, to yet another episode of the Vibes de Alma podcast. Today, we have Cassie Uhl, and I'm super excited for this conversation. And we're going to be talking about advocacy for the earth and all of her living beings, and what does that mean, right? It we're talking about sustainability, how to connect with the elements of the earth. We're also talking about how can we protect different aspects of the earth, including humans. So in this conversation, we do talk about social justice, and I just want to give you a heads up because we do talk about some things that are heavier. And a part of social justice and social advocacy is also death and grief. So if you're not ready for these topics, we don't go super in detail, honestly, but it's still a word of caution. So if you're not ready to listen to these types of conversations or these topics, remember this is always going to be here for whenever you're ready. And regardless of whether you feel ready now or if you feel ready later, this is a beautiful conversation I'm having with Cassie Uhl, and I'm just super excited for you to listen. So feel free to give us a thumbs up and subscribe now that you're watching the video on YouTube, and let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. In this episode, we have Cassie Uhl, a trauma-informed energy healer, a death doula, and an advocate for all living beings and inhabitants here on Earth. She offers experiential teachings through guided journeys, energy healing sessions, intuitive mentorship, and ritual guidance. She believes in holding that safe space for anyone in need of deep healing in order to explore themselves and ultimately become their own healers. So thank you so much for being here on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Ashley.
Yes, I'm super excited. If someone is wanting to start incorporating social justice in their day-to-day life, how would they be able to do that?
Absolutely. I'm happy to speak to that. For me, social justice work really naturally became a part of my magical and spiritual practice as my practice went back to as I started to connect more with the teachings from the land that I come from, which is mostly Northern Europe. Um, all of the practices there throughout Northern Europe are earth-based practices. And with an earth-based practice, it was impossible for me to separate social justice and activism from my spiritual and magical practice. They are one and the same because in order for me to have a relationship with the earth that is rooted in reciprocity and care, I have to be aware of my positionality as a white-bodied woman living on stolen land. I currently reside on Miyamiyaki land, which is in so-called Indiana of so-called United States. And when my practice is rooted in my relationship with the earth, I can't separate those things. I have to address my relationship to the land and all of the layers of that. So a big part of my practice is learning about the original inhabitants of this land who are still here and learning about what my ancestors' heart was in the destruction and genocide and displacement of the people on the land where I live. So it's almost like, well, of course, why wouldn't social justice be a part of my spiritual practice? Like it has to be. Otherwise, it feels like for me, like my relationship with the land, I do a lot of work with flowers and trees and elemental spirits. And, I'm not going to have the same depth of relationship with those beings if I'm not approaching my relationship from a place of like truth and honesty. And so those things have to kind of go hand in hand with my practice. And it's like once you sort of dive in, once I, dove into it, it's like there's so much, there's such a need for so many different parts of social justice and advocacy, when it comes to being a land protector, a water protector, protecting, Indigenous people's rights and reparations. I mean, there are endless ways to get involved. But I think for me, like the most important and like the best starting place for me was to just research and understand the land that I'm on, whose land it is, or at least who are the original stewards of the land,
Mm.
and what is my relationship, what is my ancestor, what are my ancestors' relationship with the land. That is a really great starting place. And I think I know for myself, like that just opened up a lot of doorways and pathways to ways to engage. And all of that connects and correlates back into my magical practice and informs it. And the other nice thing is that my magical spiritual practice is what really enables me to remain active in social justice work, and advocacy for the earth and all inhabitants of this earth. Um, spiritual grounding,
Mm.
clearing, having really strong boundaries. And sometimes that looks like, daily embodiment practices to make sure that my energy is moving and clear and that I'm connected to the earth. But those things all help me remain engaged and able to show up in a really deliberate, conscious way where I'm in alignment with truly um, advocating for all living beings and the land that I'm on.
Yeah, that's beautiful how continuing to build and just sustain your spiritual practice is also helping you stay focused on the social justice around your community and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's so important because I know for me, like the deeper I get in, there's so much to grieve. Um,
Yeah.
so much to grieve. And the only way that I know how to be with my grief is to have a spiritual practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is the only way, it's like. And so they all go hand in hand. And that's why, I do a lot of work in grief spaces. I do a lot of work with actively dying. I hold death cafes in my community. I hold death literacy. Um, I, I like to make that a really present part of my spiritual practice too, because I think if we are approaching our practices from a place of being really honest about our relationship with the earth. And that varies for everybody. Like I said, for myself as a white bodied person, like that relationship is very different than somebody who is indigenous to
Hmm.
the so-called United States. They have a totally different set of challenges, but there's grief there still. So there's just different layers of grief. So grief, death, that's such a big part of spirituality that I think needs to be addressed and acknowledged and allowed. And like, we need to like let it in more because I really think it's one of the only ways that we're going to make it through this phase that we're in, this very intense phase here on Earth, is by acknowledging and honoring our grief and the sadness. And I think for um, a lot of white folks, especially, and I add myself into this because I was one of these people who did not know how to be with my grief
Yeah.
for so long. And I think it's hard for a lot of folks who have been really ingrained in a white supremacist patriarchal society
Yeah.
because we're taught to ignore it.
Yeah, we dismiss it. Like if you're working with corporate America, you have 2 days, 3 days to grieve, and then you have to come back to work and be normal. And that's not at all how grief works.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to ask you questions and go deeper into death work and how that looks like in the spiritual community or just in our community, period, right? Because I feel like spirituality shouldn't be something outside of the norm, right? Like just like how we go to a doctor for healthcare, how we do exercise and we try to eat healthier foods for our physical health, like spiritual health is also just as important, and that includes emotions and grief. Anyways, so I wanted to ask you about like what was that spark or that time where that light bulb went off for you, where you were going under your spiritual practice and you're like, oh, I have to incorporate like social justice. They're not separate, they're one.
Well, I would say there were a lot of little sparks, in tying it to the grief work as well, because I think they're very connected.
Mm.
my journey into grief work started when my grandmother died. She died of cancer, and I was able to be with her for much of her dying process. And that was the first time that I realized that I was able to remain very grounded and present in situations where everybody around me was just really unhinged.
Mm,
The rest of my family did not know how to be with my grandma. They did not know how to be with death, with grief. It was just chaos, which is really common.
yeah.
Death throws families into chaos because we're a society that by and large avoids talk of death and dying. And so that really opened up my eyes to my ability, because I had been meditating and having like a pretty strong spiritual practice since I was like a teenager. So I was just able to put all of those tools to use and remain really grounded in that situation. And, I would say that was a first tipping point. And then in 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, it opened my eyes in a new way that I was not being proactive enough
Mm,
in my activism and social justice. Um, and so that was another tipping point for me of just being like, I can't just say, "Oh, I'm a good person," and like I was just doing a lot of performative stuff that now I can look back on it and say, "Oh, a lot of what I was doing was very performative." And it wasn't until I started learning from more Black women and Indigenous women, reading, taking courses, because I had so much unlearning to do.
mm,
But when I started doing that unlearning in earnest, it was abundantly clear to me that I had to be um, more proactive and get uncomfortable in ways that I had been taught and trained that I didn't have to do, like as a young white person growing up in the so-called United States. Um, I just I was so shielded, which is what we see
mm,
in a lot of with a lot of folks, is this idea that like, oh, I don't have to do anything. That's not my job. And it's like once I did a lot of unlearning, I was like, oh, this actually is my job. And in fact, like I was saying, like if I really believe in my spiritual practice, then my spiritual practice is really out of line with my beliefs.
mm,
And I think for some it can be like, oh, like once that drops in, that's where the grief comes in of like, oh, that's heavy. That's a lot. That's a lot to untangle and hold of like, I've been living my life out of alignment with my spiritual practice. And then once I had that awakening of, oh shit, I need to make some changes that are going to be uncomfortable. And I'm going to have to move through a lot of grief. So I think that my awareness and understanding of grief is what sort of enabled me to be more honest with myself
mm.
and show up in ways that were uncomfortable for me and are less and less so uncomfortable every day for me. And again, my spiritual practice and magical practice play hand in hand with that too. Like one of the reasons I'm able to show up is because um, I use the tools available to me, like grounding and using protection in different ways, protection magic in different ways, and tending to my grief through my spiritual practice. Yeah, so it's a little roundabout, but I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, because a lot of times it is a series of events that just leads you to that catharsis or that
Hmm.
cathartic moment where it's like, oh, yeah, I
Yeah.
understand now. Yeah. So that definitely answered the question. And as we continue talking about grief, right?
Hmm.
You underwent a training for death
Hmm.
doulaship, so you can
Hmm.
sit with this. And I guess how did that unfold? Did you start with death doula work because of the experience that you had with your family and your grandmother, or did you start doing this prior to that experience?
No, it was definitely as a result. And
Okay.
I had a few. So I lost my grandmother, and then 6 weeks later, my dad died suddenly, and then I lost a like it was just like 2 years of like back to back deaths. Um, and it was a real initiation for
Mm,
me of um, learning how to be with death. And I also had a lot of pretty intense spiritual experiences of like visitations. Um, from the dying. And so I was sort of like in this like in between space of I know that I am intended to work with folks at end of life, but I didn't know what that meant because I didn't know I'd never heard of a death doula at that time. And so I was like, do I need to go back to school? I was thinking of like going back to school to get a nursing license to be in hospice. And I was like, I really don't want to go back to school. And then as soon as I heard the term death doula, I was like, that's it. That is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I know, I mean, I'm trying to remember what year it was. It was maybe 2020 or I think it was 2020 that I did my training with ENELDA, which is the International End of Life Doula Association.
mhm,
Um, which was wonderful. So yeah, it was definitely the initiation of several deaths with my family that led me to that as a part of my, you know, many. When people ask me, "What do you do?" I'm like, "Oh, I do all the things,"
yes.
you know, which I think is really common for a lot of mystic women and femmes. Like we're
Mhm.
very, multi-passionate. And I'm just like, yeah, I used to try to like find my niche. I'm like, no, I'm just gonna like cycle through the things as my body calls, as the land calls, and honor whatever wants to come forward when it's time.
Yeah, and it is meant to cycle through because
Hmm.
I remember when I first found you, you had like the chakras, the ultimate book about the chakras, and you had one about auras as well. You had one for tarot that had just recently came out when I found you, but the chakras and the auras were already there. And I remember I could see auras, but I didn't understand what it was or and then it's just your books, especially for me at that time, were just so rich with information, yet simple and straightforward. And it was easy for me to be able to like put things together between the chakras and the auras and all of that. And it's funny that now it's not really funny. It's not hilarious at all, actually, but now that you're here working with social justice and death doulaship, like I've also found my way towards this path, right?
Hmm.
So it's kind of funny that you're evolving and you're very knowledgeable, extremely knowledgeable. You have been working on this since you were a teenager because of your beautiful grandmother, who may rest in peace. Which is something else that I wanted to ask you too,
Hmm.
because I know that you grew up in a Christian household, but
Hmm.
yet you were under the wing of your grandmother, who also showed you all of these beautiful things that you're now doing with your life.
Yeah. Oh, it gives me shivers. It just warms my heart to hear you talk about her. And I know because I've wrote about her and my experience with her in my books. But yeah, I really feel her presence now.
Mm,
She did, she was the person who made me feel like it was safe to explore an alternative.
yeah.
I didn't grow up in a household that was like strictly Christian or like we didn't go to church every Sunday, but it was sort of like the expectation. And sometimes there would be comments from my mom of like, oh, like we don't use tarot, like that's the devil's work. And, my grandma, she lived and breathed by astrology.
Mm.
And I remember we would go over to her house and we'd be like, Grandma, get out your pendulum. And she would get out her pendulum and we would ask her questions. And it was just like this whole alternate reality of like, wow, like there's another way. And one of the first books that I got. I cannot remember the author, but it was about like working with your energy and it just like it made everything make sense to me. Because I could feel my energy. Um and so I just remember like sitting in my room as like a teenager and like feeling like and I could feel the energy centers and I could feel my aura and I had like a really bad back injury and I could feel like the back injury like just like hovering my hands over my body. Um, and so my grandma was somebody that we didn't necessarily like talk a lot about, like, the energy stuff, because even that was still, like, a little bit, like, taboo, but she would talk astrology, we would talk pendulums, but it she was the one who basically, like, made me feel safe enough to explore those things just like, living her life and doing that.
Mhm.
So I'm so eternally grateful, and it's funny because for a long time, I really avoided astrology because she was maybe a little like when I was growing up, I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, grandma, like you are too into astrology." Like she would like not leave the house on some days and I was just like, so I avoided astrology for so long because I was just like, I just can't. I just can't like it just made my grandma a little bit too over the top, but now I'm like, "Oh, I think I'm right there with her now." Like
Mhm. Yeah. During the solar eclipse, I did not leave my house.
I did. I definitely fucked around with the solar eclipse. But I know
Interesting.
everybody's got different stuff. I mean, I think solar eclipses are very special, unique events, and I don't know that I would like mess with all of them, but I got some very clear invitations from some of my guides. So I did work some magic for this one, and it was some pretty rad magic. So
Oh, that's exciting.
yeah.
Yes, yes. I mean, astrology is individual to each person. Like I stayed
Hmm.
in because I needed to that day, right? The energies
Yeah.
were different for me. But
Yeah.
for you, it was a beautiful invitation for you to create something,
Hmm.
right? So,
Yeah.
mm, that's beautiful. It was just nice to hear about like the joy of those memories, right, with your grandmother and like how she was able to give you this safe space for you to change, right, the
Hmm.
regular religious household that you grew up with and to explore things that made sense for you, that made you feel
Hmm.
peace. Because that in and of itself is also, it comes with a grieving process,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Of I grew up with these beliefs. I grew up with this is safe, this is not safe. And then it's like I find that there's some practices that were deemed not safe and not good for me to do
Hmm.
that are what have helped me be more grounded, that have helped me be more stable, maybe have helped decompress my nervous system.
Hmm.
Um, so did you experience having to grieve the beliefs that you grew up with into the ones that you have now?
Um, Not so much, especially with the religion stuff. It was so I tell people sometimes, like, I remember being very young in like like summer Bible camp and like them telling us some story. And just in my little like 6, 7 year old mind, I was like, oh no. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. So I never like I was not one of those people that was like, "Yeah, I'm into it." Like I was just never I was always just like, "This I don't know what y'all are talking about, but this doesn't make any sense to me." So that's like when my grandma was like, "There's an alternative." I was like, "Oh, thank goodness," because this other situation is just not working out for me. Now, what I will say, it's interesting that you asked that because there certainly were pieces that I had to grieve because my grandma was very much indoctrinated into this like what I call like the new age cult of spirituality, which I feel like, um, I think the word new age is really tricky because I think there
Mm,
can be aspects of new age, or like sometimes people like use this word in different ways and it means different things to different people. But I started to see a lot of overlaps in what some might call quote unquote new age spirituality with white supremacy culture. Um, a hyperfixation on toxic positivity,
mm,
um, love and light, and not experiencing things like grief, rage, sadness, pain, or like this idea that if you, that you can, this magical thinking that you can think your way out of, you know, horrific situations, which is like, right now, um, in Gaza, we're witnessing like this horrible, horrible genocide. And it's like this idea that you can like manifest your way out of a genocide is is just so heartbreaking and
mm,
sad. And so there was a lot, like my grandmother definitely fell into that more like quote unquote new age spirituality. So I was sort of raised with like that magical thinking, the manifesting mind of like, oh, I just need to be positive and think my way out of things. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older and started learning more about the practices of my ancestors and the earth based spiritual practices that I was like, this doesn't. And like I said, that awakening for me in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, where I had to get really honest about some of my beliefs that I had still kind of been holding on to because they were beliefs that my grandma had.
Yeah.
So those parts I had to grieve of like, just because it's spiritual doesn't mean that it's, um, just because it's labeled as spiritual doesn't mean that it's actually kind or
Mm.
good or true. And so there were a lot of parts of my spiritual practice that I had to grieve and let go of because I realized they were no longer in line with my moral values anymore. And I had to give myself a lot of grace that I didn't know any better. But it's like
Yeah.
once you know better, you do better. And once I learned like some of these tenets of the quote unquote new age spirituality of like manifesting and toxic positivity and you know only love and light all the time are not only like they're not only harming myself but they're harming other people too. And I think about if my grandma were still alive, I think those would be some really interesting conversations that we would be having because she was very tuned in and aware of the pain and the suffering in the world.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that if she would have had like a different viewpoint, she would have also been like, oh, yeah, some of this is really harmful and doesn't really align with my moral values either.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some grieving in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just like how you said, when you know better, you do better. And at that time, like we didn't have the resources that we have now,
Hmm.
or the things that have arisen that we have now. And now you're here carrying on the legacy.
Yeah, yeah, and change is part of life. I mean, we're intended to change. We're cyclical beings, and that's one of the things I talk about in my next book, Craft Your Own Magic, is like the cyclical nature of magic and having a spiritual practice. And like we are intended, like my body is of the earth, our bodies are of the earth. And like the earth, we are intended to go through generative cycles of death and rebirth and growth and decay, like all of those. And those cycles come in waves throughout our lives at different times. And like it is not only necessary, but beautiful to allow your magical or spiritual practice to for parts of it to die and compost, and so that you can allow new things. And like we are not intended to have the same beliefs for our entire lives, just like our bodies are not intended to stay the same. How sad. And that's just a tool of patriarchy, this linearity that's ingrained in so many of us at a really young age that can bring this sense of shame for being like, oh, actually, I think that belief that I once had was actually harmful and I don't believe it anymore. Like it's so rare to see people say that in the world, but I'm like, we need like let's more of that, please. Like we are
Yeah.
intended to change our minds. We are intended to transform and evolve, and shame doesn't have to be a part of it.
Mm-mm.
Grief certainly can, like, grieve it, feel it. I had to grieve a lot of those, beliefs that I had to let go of and face the harm that I had caused in not only believing those, but, like, sharing blog posts. Like, I had to go through so many of my old blog posts and be like, "Oh my goodness, like, I don't believe this anymore." Um, delete.
Yeah. Gone. Bye.
Yes, and then is also important for me to be like, and this is why. This is why I don't believe this anymore. And I know that, this book that I have coming out, I'm sure like 10 years from now, I'll be like, oh yeah, I said some questionable things in there and I've changed my mind since. And that's
Hmm.
okay because I'm a evolving human. So I'm really here for more of the evolving humans who are just like really ready to be like, yeah, I was wrong about that. Like I've actually reconsidered. Yeah.
Yes. So your book, Craft Your Magic, is coming
Hmm.
out soon.
Hmm.
Um, would you like to tell us more about the book and how you merge all of the beautiful things together in your book?
Yeah. Craft Your Own Magic is really my desire is that it serves as a blueprint
Mm,
for folks who want a magical practice that is rooted in a lot of integrity and a lot of honesty and authenticity. Um,
I love that.
yeah, I don't shy away from a lot of the topics that we've discussed here. I address, understanding your relationship with the land, regardless of what that relationship looks like. And, I can't, of course, in the book, I can't speak to what any one person should do because it varies for each person. But what I hope is that it provides, like I said, sort of a blueprint for ways to navigate the nuance. Because so often in magical spaces, I see a lot of like scripted spells and like do this and this plus this, and then this will happen. And that just hasn't been my experience. The more that my magical practice evolves, the more clear it is that the potency of my magic is contingent upon my ability to be in relationship with the beings that I am working with. So, for
Mm,
example, if I am working with mugwort, if I do not have a relationship with mugwort, then whatever magic I am crafting is probably not going to work very well. That would be like going up to a stranger and being like, hey, like, do you mind doing this for me? Like, they're good chance they might not do it. They might just be like, I don't know you, go away.
yeah.
Well, mugwort is a sovereign living being. And so if my practice isn't rooted in first, like forming a relationship with the spirit of mugwort, um, that's like the foundational place. So aside from, I kind of work through all of the elements in the book. So Earth is kind of facing and addressing like what is your connection to your ancestry and your ancestors and the land that you're on. And then from there we move to intuition and relationship building because I think that that's where so much of a lot of magical texts and blog posts. And, like I said, raising my hand, I am one of those people who used to write those very formulaic blog posts of like, this is how you do this is how you do that. And here I am changing my mind and saying, actually, I've found out in my practice it works a lot better if I form a relationship with these different beings before engaging in magic with them. Um, because my practice is also rooted in animism, which is a belief that um, all living beings are all things are alive and not only alive but sovereign. And so I regard the mugwort or the lilac tree in as much of a regard as I do like a beloved human. They are they are kin, they are family, and I treat them as such in my magical practice. So the book really walks through what that looks like, what that can look like in a magical practice, and how to do that with a lot of integrity from a lot of different, like vantage points.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you were mentioning earlier too, how with the magic of the different elements that we have here on Earth, we also have different ways we can be socially active,
Mhm.
or just help with the sustainability. Like you talked about like water conservation, maybe not just talk about, helping the
I
waters
did.
and then
I think, yeah, I think I talked about being a water protector. Yeah.
yes, yes. And then the earth, and even the air as well. So I'm a chemistry teacher. right? And I, for Earth Day, had all my students do sustainability project to just share like an aspect of today's daily living that, needs a little bit more support in being sustainable for the earth. And a lot of the students decided to talk about transportation or just travel. And it brought up the fact that there's a lot of, what's the word? It's not pollutants. Sorry, my brain with my Spanish is like mixing right now. Pollution.
Hmm.
There's a lot of pollution in the air, and I have a belief personally, which I
Hmm.
think is now starting to get backed up by science and immunology, right? That the reason why there's so many allergies right now is not because of the pollen, it's because of the air pollution that we're living
Hmm.
in. Because the more highly industrialized an area is, the more allergies there are in its population.
Hmm. I
So
mean, that
it's
makes
just,
total sense to me. I don't know
yeah,
anything about the science that backs it up, but I'm like, it sounds like it makes sense.
yeah. And it's just, it is nice to be in a relationship with the earth. We come from the earth, we go back to the earth.
Hmm.
And a lot of beautiful magic just happens with the earth. So,
Hmm.
what are some ways in which people, from your perspective, right, can be more sustainable, can start building these types of relationships with the land that they're in or their surroundings?
Yeah. I think the first thing, which I already mentioned, but I think it's really important, is just if you are not on the land that your ancestors originally came from, researching and understanding the land that you're on and who the original caretakers are of that land. Because having that basic framework, that basic understanding can be really informative of how to like engage with the land. Like for example, like that's one of the reasons why I'm politically engaged in um, taking care of the land and restoring land to indigenous hands. Beyond that, I really tell people like get outside and like be open and curious. But I think like it doesn't like I just think like get outside, go to the earth, like go to the earth, listen. And like I tell people too, I'm like, it doesn't matter if you're in a super urban area. There are plants of all different kinds. And like, I mean, I will see stuff growing through the cracks in the sidewalk. Like life is there. So you can connect just as easily with a tree growing in a parking lot as you can in the middle of a forest. Um, but just begin noticing. I posted something on Instagram just yesterday that was about like how it always amazes me how I will walk the same forest path. I just moved back to Indiana from Arizona a couple years ago, but I've been walking some of these forests for almost 2 years now. And I will still run into plants and I'm like, oh, hello, who are you? I have never seen you before. But it's like the plants that are ready to engage with you and work with you, they will let themselves be known to you when it is ready, when it is time for you to know them. So I love to tell people like just go for a walk and see what gets your attention. And if a specific tree, a plant, a flower gets your attention, just go spend some time with it. And as you engage intuitively with it, it'll depend a little bit on what your unique intuitive abilities are. We have one way is the five clairs. So we have clairsentience, um, clairaudience, clairvoyance. I won't go through all the clairs, but some people see in the mind's eye, some people feel, sense in the body, some people hear things. So be open to the ways that information can flow in, but really try to honor, if you feel like a nudge of like just noticing the same tree. Like sometimes I'll just be like, oh, I'm just noticing all of these juniper trees all of a sudden. Then I'm like, oh yeah, like juniper tree obviously wants to work with me. Like I'm gonna go hang out with juniper tree for a little bit. And maybe for you, like being outside isn't your jam. And maybe it's like, oh, I just hear people talking about pendulums all the time. Or I keep seeing, like, on blog posts or hearing on podcasts, people talking about amethyst. Take that as a sign to start connecting with some amethyst. So I think just being aware of what's sort of coming into your periphery can be a really great starting point, because a lot of times that is those beings are like, hey, I got something, I want to work on something with you. And I see it kind of as like an invitation. So when I start to get nudges from gods, goddesses, animals, plants, like, I take notice, and I'm like, "Okay, I'm getting the message."
Yes, yes, I receive, I receive.
Mhm, mhm. And I think the more that we, like, get into a flow, and I talk about this in the book, this idea of, like, working very cyclically with our magical practice of there are phases, it's sort of like the new moon phase of where I am just, like, receptive and open to who does want to work with me, instead of being like, this is what I want, this is how I want to do it, I need this thing, I need this thing. Instead, I try to approach it as, okay, I'm open, like you said, open to receiving, like, who does want to work with me. And of course that comes with a lot of discernment. I'm not just going to be like, yeah, open yourself up, and whoever comes in, like, that's cool, work with them even if it seems like it's some sketchy demon. No. Like, don't, you have to use discernment, which is a whole other topic I discuss in the book. Um, so that is kind of an advanced practice of opening yourself up, but I think it's a really powerful practice, because then you're really working collaboratively with the spirit realm of saying, like, I am open. Who wants to work with me? And it's more like an invitation than a demand,
Mm,
which I think can be really powerful when we're working with other beings in a way that's more relational and like an invitation, rather than this is what I want to do and this is how I want to do it. I mean, it's just like relationships with people in our lives.
mhm.
Yeah, I went a little off track there. You get me. You asked me an exciting question, so I just like,
Oh,
I
you're
got.
good. Go anywhere you want with any of the questions. It's beautiful because you kept asking about like how you talk about certain things in the book. And the next question that I had in my mind was, all right, so when is your book coming out? Can people
Mhm.
pre-order the book? How can they find it?
Pre-orders are not open yet, but keep an eye out, because when that pre-orders do open, which will probably be, because so the book comes out in September. September. Maybe it will. Maybe pre-orders will start. I should know all this stuff. What is up with my editor?
You're going with the flow.
Yeah, I'm going with the flow. Yeah, pre-orders will probably be open in like July, I would imagine. And it's going to be out in audiobook. It'll be my first audiobook, so I'm really excited about that. So
That's
it'll
so
be an
exciting.
audio and physical, and they'll both come out at the same time in September, which I believe it's like end of September. Yeah. So just keep an eye out. I can send you a link to get on my newsletter. I have like um, a free guided meditation that I offer to connect with your spirit guides, or a spirit guide when you sign up for my newsletter. But that's the best place to stay in the know about when the book will come out, because I will be sharing about it on there. And social media is just such a garbage heap right now. So, I'm on there, but not the newsletter is definitely the best place to stay in the know.
Yeah, there's algorithms and things with social media
Yeah.
to stay connected with you, not only to just be in the know when it's coming out, but to also know where it will be available, how it can be pre-ordered, how
Yeah.
can it be listened to if you prefer audiobooks instead of, having it in person, all of those beautiful things. And that's just exciting. If you're listening to this and you're wanting to connect with your own personal spiritual practice, or if you vibe, I mean, if you're listening to this at this point, you vibe with anything that you said. So you should definitely get the book. Um,
I agree 100%.
yes, yes, it's only going to add to your life. Um, is there anything else that you would like to share for anyone listening to this about social justice, about crafting your magic, about building that relationship with the self, or even grief? Just anything that we talked about that you feel like needs to be shared.
Yeah. I think what's coming to mind for me right now is the need to honor grief. And I think for a lot of folks it can be really challenging to know to to even start with that, because we
Mm,
for the most part live in a very grief starved society, because we're not really given spaces to grieve. Um so I I find that sometimes like working into a space where I can really feel my grief can take some time. So, a practice I would like to offer is really simple. And this is something I do. Like, I'm sure some of y'all can relate. Like, maybe you feel that heaviness in your body or that sense of like tightness. It feels different for everybody. But I know for me, when I've got grief in my body that's just like waiting for me to allow it some space, it can feel a little tight in my chest. It can feel like a pit in my stomach. And sometimes I just need to like turn on some music and move my body for a little bit to even get to a place where I can let that grief come out. Um, and so I think working with the body can be a really powerful way to approach grief. And that can look, however you are able to access your body. Maybe it's rolling around on the ground. Sometimes that's what it looks like for me. Maybe it's jumping around. Maybe it's moving a lot. And also allowing um, sound and emotion to come out as much as you are able to. um Shaking, like I love shaking my arms out and shaking my hands out, but just giving yourself a lot of space to even get into the right frame of mind. I don't Frame of mind doesn't work. I'm like, to get into the body enough where the grief can really come out,
Yeah.
um because we live in a society, most of us, where we are constantly pulled out of our bodies. We're constantly pulled to the external. So getting into the body and allowing that grief space to come out, it can like take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
It requires a little bit of slowness. Um, and so that's what I would offer, is just being really loving and compassionate with yourself. And when you feel like you have that grief pit in your stomach, just really giving yourself as much time as you can to let it come out, because sometimes it can take some coaxing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I love that tool because I try to connect with grief personally, and I had like a whole grief journal and I would write, right? But the thing about grief is that it's such a complex emotion.
Hmm.
And it's always, I feel like, usually tied with other emotions as well. So like if you're trying to like write about it, it can be confusing.
Hmm.
So really that reminder to just get with the body, just let the body process it, shake it out. You don't have to understand what the grief is there for. That'll come if it's meant to, right?
Hmm.
So that's a really good reminder for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, thank you. So you shared about the newsletter, you shared about your amazing book coming out soon. How can people find you outside of just the link that I have with the newsletter where they can keep up with you?
Yeah. So the website is cassieuhl.com, and I do offer one-on-one. So I do grief companionship, and I do energy work as well as some other things, but those are kind of my main and intuitive and magical mentorship. So you can work with me one-on-one. And then, like I said, I am on Instagram. It's at Cassie Uhl. I'm not on there super often. I'm in my stories pretty regularly, but I don't post super often. So you can find me on there. But yeah, the website and the newsletter are the best places to stay in touch.
Yes, and I vouch for following her on Instagram too, because even though you don't post a lot, when
Yeah.
you do post, they're very like beautiful posts, and I feel like they add, to like the
Hmm.
content that I'm seeing, and also even your stories too. Like you just have, I don't know, they're just like a fountain of beautifulness and information, and it's just, yeah.
Thank you so much. That is so kind of you. It makes me feel because I am such a me on Instagram right now. I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know if we can stay together. We might need to break up. So that inspires me to keep posting on there.
Yes, girl, I follow you. I get excited when I see you. I'm like, ah, another post, another story.
That's very sweet of you. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Yes, yes, of course. And then if anybody wants to also follow you or just get information how to get in touch with you, with the book, with her services, or just more information on her, please look at the show notes where I have everything available. And thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much, Ashley. This was wonderful.
Oh my gosh, this episode was amazing. If you are looking forward to reading her book, Craft Your Own Magic, make sure that you click on the show notes and you go and sign up for her newsletter. That way you can be the first to know when it's coming out. And I actually just Googled Craft Your Own Magic by Cassie Uhl, and I was able to find that you can already start pre-ordering these yourself. So if you want to pre-order your book and your copy, please make sure you do so. You do not want to miss out on this beautiful book and her beautiful work. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you give a thumbs up to this video. Make sure that you subscribe. That way you're in the know for future podcast videos here on this YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening, y'all. Until next time.